the distinguished professor. Let me start again. I am privileged to honor our distinguished speaker today, Professor Ishtaq Ahmed. I have three tasks before I begin this meeting. The first task is to tell you about the Center for Peace and Economic Prosperity in South Asia. It's a non-government, it's a non-profit, it's only an academic forum just to understand and learn the things which are happening in South Asia. And here only students and the followers of South Asia are present. And we just are in an academic endeavor and nothing more than that. So that's all about the center. The second is the task to introduce you to a topic which I need not elaborate because it is well, understood. Right-wing extremism in South Asia. So I don't want to take a minute or even a little bit that. About Professor Ishtaq Ahmed, he also need no introduction. People who are new to him, I would request you that you just type on the Google bar Professor Ishtaq Ahmed and you will get everything about him. So let's start the meeting and over to you, Professor Ishtaq.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali Mustafa, Sayyid Ali Mustafa. It's a privilege and an honor to speak on your forum. I was looking forward to the discussion today. The rise of right-wing extremism in South Asia. First of all, let's make clear what's the distinction between the right wing and the left wing and the center. At the time of the French Revolution, as it was taking place, in the French Grand Assembly, those who sat on the right of the president of the assembly were monarchists who believed in the feudal order and the power of the church. On the left were those who wanted a revolution for civil and political rights, mainly of the propertied classes, but it was in the name of the French people. In the center were the people who were constitutionalists, who wanted to reform, but through constitutional means. So that's the origin of this term. I would say that if we then transpose this idea to the 20th century, and if we focus on our region, South Asia, I would say that right-wing extremism was a reflection of the era of mass politics. In the center was the Indian National Congress, trying very hard, endeavoring to bring all types of Indians on one platform. With Mahatma Gandhi in the leadership, it was opened to the masses. I think 4 annas was the membership fee. And from an elite party which used to pledge loyalty to the king, it became a party demanding more and more representation for the Indian people. At that time, from the Muslim side, the Muslims were a minority, but a very prominent minority because historically they had been associated with the Mughal state and were at the center of power until the British took over. And the Muslim aristocracy was very apprehensive of the idea of democracy, the idea of people getting the right to vote, all Indians becoming one. And Sir Syed, although I would not say that he was an extremist, he represented right-wing ideas of the Muslim aristocracy identifying with the British, their immediate and long-term interests, and opposing the Indian National Congress. Then, of course, there is a long history with which we are all too very familiar. I would say that there are some incidents in the background of which right-wing forces emerged let's say, among the Hindu majority. First of all, already when Sir Syed was arguing for Hindus and Muslims as two separate nations in Bengal, a similar, Hindu awakening was taking place. I referred to Professor Partha Ghosh. He wrote an article, and I was very surprised that in 1858, already in Bengal, the Hindus had started accusing Muslims as a whole for the oppression of Bengali culture. So these were the ideas which were around, but into the 20th century, we then have the Khilafat movement, and then I would say the Khilafat movement was an anti-imperialist, anti-British move in which Muslims and Hindus came together to protest British policies. They also joined hands to protest the Rowlatt Acts. They also joined hands to protest the massacre at the Jallianwala Bagh. But then certain events take place. Nobody knows if there was some forces, not visible, but acting, intelligence services, whatever, we don't know. But you get two very big cases of Hindu-Muslim communal violence. One is 1921, the Mopla uprising. Ali Mujtaba, you would know much better than me, and you can always add your opinion about it. It suddenly brought Hindus and Muslims at loggerheads and led to several thousand deaths. We know that. Then in 1924, you have the Kohat massacres of Hindus and mainly Hindus, but some Sikhs also, because apparently somebody had written a disparaging article about the Holy Prophet. And so in 1923, Savarkar, who was originally one of the authors of this, the War of Independence, in which Hindus and Muslims had worked together, now became a proponent of Hindu nationalism. So Hindutva idea is from 1923, and 1925 is the founding of the RSS. So you get the Hindu versions of right-wing ideas. What are right-wing ideas? Right-wing ideas are a belief in the organic unity of the community or the group. Right-wing ideas subordinate the individual and his freedoms to the group's overall interests. Right-wing ideas believe in tradition, in the continuity of customs. Left-wing ideas are always challenging this and believe in some sort of progress and change. So this is to be kept in mind. Okay? So right-wing ideas we find emerging among Hindus, but these were marginal because mainstream freedom movement was still led by the Indian National Congress and its variety of leaders, which included Muslims. And you had the biggest Muslim organization, the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind, supporting the Indian National Congress. So all these allegations that Muslims as a whole were opposed to the freedom struggle is just propaganda. Now we come to the Muslim part of it. You see, I would say there is a triangle. The British want to retain India forever if they can. The Congress wants power to be transferred to Indians as soon as possible. And the Indian led by Jinnah and the All India Muslim League, they want a separate course, separate reservations for the Muslim minority. So this is the triangle.
Tank la pagamari that interest unda. Tank.
Somebody is interfering here. Can you?
Can everyone? Can you mute your mic? Hello,
I think you should tell everyone to.
இல்ல கேட்டேன் போமா அப்படின்னு சொல்லி கேட்டேன் அப்படிதான்
Can you mute your mic?
Aravind Saab, please switch off your mic. Ishtiaq Saab, please.
Yeah.
Unmute, yeah. So let me continue. I mean, we have to come to the modern time, but we can't do it because to believe that this has happened suddenly is wrong. It's deeply rooted in the politics of the 20th century. So if you look then on the Muslim side, you have Allama Iqbal coming up with his idea of a Muslim state in northwestern India, although I have shown that if such a state were to come into being, it would include only about 22% of the Muslim population. And rest of the Muslims will be left in India. After Iqbal, then you have Chaudhry Rahmat Ali coming up with fantastic ideas about the Pakistanis being a nation in their own right, who do not dine, who do not sit together, whose heroes are different, whose worldview is different from Hindus. So this dichotomization from the Muslim side also takes place. At the same time, we find in 1937, Savarkar writing that it's a folly of those who believe that Hindus and Muslims can be one nation. I have quoted it in my book in Jinnah, his successes, failures, and role in history. So people can go and check it. Followed by, this is 1937, followed by 1938, Gawalkar saying that people living in India will have to subordinate themselves to Hindu culture. They will have to accept the supremacy of Hinduism. And then in 1939, he comes up with this idea that, look, in Germany, the Germans are getting rid of Jews and we should learn a lesson from them. So from both sides, we find separatism, dehumanization, demonization of the other, Hindus and Muslims. But in the center is the Indian National Congress. Unfortunately, and people have to read my book, India could not be kept united in 1947. Two states emerged based on the idea that Muslims and Hindus need separate states. Although I've shown that Jinnah's two-nation theory left 1/3 of Muslims in India. So it was not a very elegant solution to the so-called Muslim-Hindu problem. And they were left in the Hindu majority provinces, where they would be most vulnerable. In the majority provinces where Muslims were in a majority, obviously that would not be the case. So this was a very strange resolution according to Jinnah's idea of two separate nations, two-nation theory. The partition takes place, 1 million people at least are killed, 14 to 15 million uprooted. People cross the international border, the Red Cliff Line in Bengal and Punjab, primarily to save their lives. So with such a baggage in your background, the two states from day one were locked up in a relationship of hostility. And you find them playing zero-sum games in international forums. You find them doing it within South Asia. And so this is the tragedy of our freedom being burdened with the memory of a bloody severance of the Indian subcontinent. But if we were now to look at how the trajectory of the two states proceeded, I know you all want me to come to the recent period, but I must build my momentum to say what I want to. Pakistan comes into being. Jinnah makes a speech, very heroic. All Hindus and Muslims will cease to be Hindus and will be seized, not in the religious sense, but as citizens of the state in this great state of Pakistan. And people were wondering for 7 years, you were telling us Hindus and Muslims under no circumstance can live together. And now you have changed the whole basis of your. Jinnah never came back and said the same thing again. I have shown that he kept on referring to Islam and the Holy Prophet and the Quran and the Sharia until he died. So those who say that Jinnah wanted a secular Pakistan have to demonstrate otherwise. Because my understanding is that Jinnah wanted India partitioned. He had no vision for a Pakistan, what it would be like. And historically, why the can't go into. But I would say like this, that if you look at the constitutional development in Pakistan, then the 7th March 1949 objectives resolution very clearly says that sovereignty over the entire world belongs to God Almighty, which he has delegated to the elected representatives of the people of Pakistan. Now, anybody who's informed about political science would know that sovereignty divided is sovereignty destroyed. Sovereignty always belongs to one institution, one person, or whatsoever. So you can't say that both were equal. From day one, Pakistan, and then the Constitution of 1956, the Constitution of 1962, the Constitution of 1973, at each stage, you find the Islamic features of the Constitution actually expanding. For example, in the third Constitution given by no other than the Islamic socialist Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, it says that not only the president, but also the Prime Minister of Pakistan will have to be Muslims, and under oath, they will have to testify that they believe in the finality of the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad. And then in 1974, this argument was then used to declare the Ahmadiyya community as non-Muslims. So I would say that in Pakistan, if you look subsequently to the blasphemy laws and the hudud laws and the laws which were introduced on rape, the laws about women giving evidence in a court of law, they are all based on the Sharia. And so what my argument is that in Pakistan, no political party which contests elections is a secular party. They are at most Muslim, modernist parties, central parties, right-wing parties, extreme right-wing parties, but a secular party contesting elections and getting into parliament is an impossibility, more or less, and there is no proof that it has ever happened. That's India. So that we come to the present. India stayed on a very great note by agreeing to a consensus on having a secular, liberal, inclusive, pluralist type of constitution, and 17 years of Jawaharlal Nehru's prime ministership gave stability to that system. He even went on to reform Hindu personal law. Previously, Hindus were as free as Muslims were. Muslims had a restriction of 4, but Hindus could marry as many wives as they wanted to. And Hindu women had no right to property. Let me underline this. Whereas in Islam, even in traditional Islam, there is a division of property of parents, and the principle is 1.5. 1 to the son and half to the daughter, but not among Hindus. Nehru went in, changed that, but he did not touch the Muslim personal law. And I think this is the beginning from where we find the Hindu right, cashing on some of the discrepancies in the Indian constitution. If all Indians had equal rights, then how come Muslims were given an exception? You have the Shah Bano case of 1985, where the Supreme Court gave a verdict in her favor that she, as an old woman, was entitled to some sort of monetary allowance from her ex-husband, who then went to the ulama, and the ulama went to the streets, agitated, and many people, Muslims joined it. And so the Indian parliament had to make an exception for Muslims. That's where I think the Hindu right started arguing that what sort of politics is this? First, they want India to be partitioned on the basis of religion, and so many millions live here. And then when they live in India, they want exceptionalism for them. They can have as many wives as they want, and follow the Islamic law, whereas the Hindu law has been changed. Untouchability had been declared a criminal offense. If one were to follow the Manusmriti, the Brahman and the Dalit cannot have one vote each. These were fantastic things, reforms which the Indian Constitution had introduced. So here we find then the Hindu right lobby moving against the Congress deformed states from Indira Gandhi and subsequently. All Congress governments make opportunistic concessions to rising Hindu nationalism, and as a result, that lobby gains. In Pakistan, on the other hand, I'm keeping the chronology in mind, what was happening on the other side. On the other side, we find in 1978, April, yes, the communists capturing power in Afghanistan. Earlier, General Ziaul Haq had come to power in July 1977. In February 1979, in Iran, the Shia ulama capture power and make a revolution. So suddenly, the radical politics sort of concentrate in Southwest Asia. And you have this influence coming into India through the Khalistan movement, because this Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, from where did he get the inspiration? Of course, from Ayatollah Khomeini, with a long beard and the same sort of ideas about a Khalistani state, a state of pure Khalsa Sikhs. And that feeds into Hindu majoritarianism. We get Indira Gandhi assassinated, but then you have the massacre of Sikhs in Delhi. Anywhere from 3 to 10,000 Sikhs apparently were killed. So if you look at how the politics of the two states were evolving, I'm not talking so much of Bangladesh, because I don't think that is so very interesting. In the end, if you want, I can say a few words about it. But I think I will concentrate on these two states, which are the nemesis of one another, in all situations. So in Pakistan, then Ziaul Haq introduces Islamic law, which is the state patronizing right-wing extremism. So here the state itself is party to right-wing ideas becoming part of the constitution and the legal system of Pakistan. The hudud laws, initially people were whipped publicly, things like this. And I'm sure while this was happening, the Hindu right-wing lobby in India was pointing out, look, what are they doing in Pakistan? We are a Hindu majority state of 80%. Why can't we have Hindu Rashtra? So if you look at the dynamics which were cutting across the borders, they were feeding one another, but both were opposing what was apparently the less extreme form. In the middle, let's say, Nawaz Sharif, I would say, or even earlier, were right of center Islamist Muslim parties. And then you have all the Islamists like Jamaat-e-Islami and Jamiat-e-Ulama Islam and Jumiyat-e-Ulama-e-Pakistan. These are the Deobandi and so on, Ahle Hadith and so on. And in India, the Congress being on the defensive over and over again for making concessions to right-wing Hindu ideas. In Kashmir, for example, Mrs. Gandhi, manipulated an election, I think in 1983 or something, and it was a very communal election campaign that she conducted. So all these ultimately mean that the state is unable to keep right-wing forces under control. In Pakistan, they are actually patronized by the state because while this was happening in Pakistan, Pakistan also got involved in the so-called Afghan Jihad. And the Afghan Jihad meant millions, hundreds and thousands of Pakistanis, Arabs, Indonesians, Malaysians, Chechens, people from all over the world coming to Peshawar, being trained into jihad, how to use weapons, going and fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. So all that ultimately brutalized the sensibilities in Pakistan. And I'm sure brutalized, or at least must have inspired Hindu right-wing forces in India who were watching all this with great apprehension, and I can understand that. So we find that the 1980s, 1990s is the ultimate, outbreak, manifestation of right-wing extremism in Pakistan. The Shia minority is cornered, and there are sectarian killings. The Iranians and the Saudis arm their sectarian militias, in Pakistan. They do it in the Middle East as well. You have all those conflicts taking place. Then in Pakistan, the Deobandi extremists, after 1989, when the Russians left, they turned their attention to the Indian Kashmir, and a lot of terrorism takes place. I am witness to, on one of my visits to Pakistan, actually 2 visits to Pakistan, finding that at the Friday prayers, there were boxes kept for the 2-3 Pakistani-based so-called non-state actors to collect money for them, chanda, for jihad. So it was openly patronized by the state to collect money to go and fight in the Indian Kashmir. They bled India, no doubt, but they couldn't really force India to give up Kashmir. That's the hard part of the story which Pakistanis cannot handle. Then,
okay, sir. We just now have 11 minutes time left. We are in a format of 40 minutes, and the 40 minutes the device will go off. So I think I have to make an intervention here, and we just have about 10 minutes or so to have any discussion on this subject. Let me open up this discussion. We all know that we are living in an extremist, kind of a state, whether it is a Pakistan or whether it is India or whether it's a Bangladesh. Even the Bangladesh, the forces of extremism is on rise. Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, the forces of Sinhala Buddhism on rise. The point here is, the pointed question is that will you see, sir, a return to the centrist position in which we have all been living very comfortably in India for so long years, or this extremism is going to continue for more time?
This question is posed to me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I think that at least in the case of Pakistan, the case is almost lost, because the current regime of Imran Khan espouses this whole Islamophobia as a major part of his foreign policy initiative. Whether the Western powers listen to him or not, we don't know. But people in Pakistan seem to be influenced by that, and they go around, with vigilante groups, mobs. Recently a Sri Lankan was brutally killed and then burnt, and they are doing it to Christians, they are doing it to Hindus, and the Ahmadiyya community is always a victim. So in Pakistan, I see no hope at the moment. About India, you would know better, because I think the Indian constitution and the secular forces are on, they are still there. There is no walkover given yet to the right-wing Hindu nationalism. In Pakistan, it's a lost case. But can Pakistan not turn the corners? I'm not one who is always willing to concede to fatalism. I think if the Pakistani leadership and the rest can, in their own interest, understand that this is what I have called nihilism. Nihilism is self-destruction. And if you don't want to self-destruct yourself, you have to do something about it. So you have to come to the center sort of position in Pakistan. And in India, I hope they do the same. Because this CAA or whatever, you know, that anybody can seek asylum in India, but not Muslims. This is openly discriminatory against the Muslims. Why did they need to do it? I find no argument, because granting asylum is always the right of the state. They could have refused the Muslims. But when you put it on in print that the Muslims will not be qualified to apply, then you are trying to identify the Muslims as a problem community, and you know the consequences of what has happened then thereafter, you know, the agitations and so on and so forth. So in India, it's a battle which is going on. In Pakistan, we are just trying to survive.
Any other question anybody would like to ask? Or let me just keep on the discussion. You see, I mean, all this extremism of, it's all political driven. I mean, suppose a state of nature would have been there where there would have not been any democracy and where everything would have been there, this extremism would not have survived. The extremism is surviving only because of the power politics and the politics to be in the seat of power and the state of governance. Now, how do you water down all this? Because ultimately the purpose of the state is the welfare of the state, people. Now the welfare of the people is obliterated in this extremist situation.
Yes.
Your comment, sir.
The reason is that ultimately what is the welfare of anyone? It is security and survival. Whether it is Darwin or it is common sense, we all know that ultimately we want to survive. And if on both sides you create this hysteria that Hinduism is going to be destroyed by the Muslim population explosion, or that the Muslims are going to take over India. And in Pakistan, they say that Pakistan is the fortress of Islam, and we are surrounded by a conspiracy of Hanood, Yahud, and Nasara, Hindus, Jews, and Christians. How do you get out of it? So I have said that it's the state elites who have to transcend this political manipulation of the fear, existentialist fear which has been created. I don't think Hindus are anytime going to disappear or become a minority. And I don't think anywhere in the world 220 million Pakistanis can be just taken off the map. So these are fears without any genuine reasons to feel so. But the two states have created this hype. At least in Pakistan, I see this being reiterated on a daily basis by our ministers. So I agree with you. All this is political, and all this is part of political manipulation. Given a chance, people have the wisdom of the centuries of living together, accommodating one another, and so on. And they have done it. They have done it for 1,000 years of Islam in the subcontinent. After all, 700 years of rule still meant only 20% were converted to Islam. So if Islam was such a horrible sort of intervention in India, why come 80% remained Hindus? They should have been forced to convert to Islam. So you can
one more question
find argument. Yeah,
one more question which is coming to my mind is that, before 47, it was the colonial rule which was supposed to be the demon and if we get rid of that colonial rule, we would have all hunky-dory situation. But now it seems the extremism is the one which is keeping people and people apart, countries and countries apart. And that is one of the most important, I feel, is the reason for the differences in the South Asia. And as long as these, what you call extremism forces keeps on having their best of their time, there cannot be any peace in South Asia. Your comments?
I agree. No, I can only agree 100% with you. My only regret is I thought we were going to have this meeting for 2 hours. And I now realize it is 40 minutes. Had you told me that this is all going to be 40 minutes, I would have concentrated more on the current period.
Yes.
But anyhow, so that's a misunderstanding. By the way, 40 minutes for me is never enough, I can tell
yes,
you.
I agree, sir. I agree, sir.
अभी तो मैं तमीद बांध रहा था. I was just building the story.
yes, I understand that. It's too little time. I mean, maybe next time we can have a longer session. And we still have about 3 minutes left. 2 minutes and 10 minutes left. 10 seconds left. So anybody else still would like to, comment on this? And just let me ask last question, probably that is the last time, that what do you see in terms of the prospects of India-Pakistan opening up dialogue in current future? When do you think it will start? Will it start?
I think the world pressure on Pakistan is immense, but Imran Khan is resisting it. Only very recently said that as long as Modi is in power, we cannot talk to India. Now that means Modi must lose an election to make possible for Imran Khan to have a dialogue with India. What can I do? If you take such categorical positions, no politicians do that, but Imran Khan does it. So we are stuck with this. You can say we want a dialogue, but on principles and so on. No, he says as long as Modi is elected, is in power, we can't have any dialogue with India. So what can I tell you as far as Pakistan is concerned?
Closed border. Yeah, please, sir, please.
Vahisa wants to
speak. I think from Mustafa Sahab, it's extremism to give only 40 minutes. This is really extremism. He should have a lot more time. No, but just to add to what Dr. Ishtiaq was saying, I think eventually both governments or people in both countries, they do know and they realize and understand that dialogue and normal relationship is the only way forward.
Absolutely.
The thing is that when the elections approach or the problems at home cannot be addressed, they resort to this old hobby horse, which is talking against each other. So you get, this is populism. This gives you a popular position in your own country, whether it's India or Pakistan. So I think they both know that dialogue is the way forward, but they resort to this kind of verbal violence